Welcome to the Astro Podcast. Today we're talking again with Darrel Rutkin. Thank you once more to join us. And we're going to talk about a topic which Darrel worked a lot in his research, which is Pico Della Mirandola and his impact on astrology. Darrel is currently a researcher at the University of Ca' Foscari in Venice and is part of an ERC project. And now I'm going to ask you to remind me of the name of the project.
Early Modern Cosmology.
Early Modern Cosmology, yes. Thank you. Well, Darrel, welcome again to the podcast. So we decided to talk. We arranged this to talk a little bit about that ever-present figure in astrology, in the history of astrology, at least of the early modern period, which is Pico della Mirandola.
Giovanni Pico Della Mirandola. With his nephew and editor, Gianfrancesco, which people often do. So it's important to be clear about that.
Yes, you're correct. We must use his complete name.
At least to begin the conversation. Then we'll refer to him as Pico all the way through. But it's important to be clear about
yes,
that.
Yes.
Not that you don't know about it. I'm sure you do, but maybe some of our outed will know.
Of course. So, Pico, and let me start by asking you this. So Pico publishes his famous book, The Disputations Against Astrology, in late 15th century, so 14...
Already you're beginning in a complicated way. Pico was dead. Pico died on the 17th of November, 1494, and his nephew and editor, Gianfrancesco, took the manuscript, the disorganized manuscript, and put it through the press, where it was published in Bologna posthumously in 1496. So already you're beginning with a complicated, problematic situation that never ends.
Exactly.
This manuscript no longer exists, so our modern editions come from that 1496 editio princeps. But there's a lot of drama around the publication. A guy named Steve Farmer wrote a long book on Pico's conclusiones, in the introduction to which he gives a sort of convoluted story about the publication of Pico's Disputations by a Savonarolan hitman. It's very dramatic. It would make a great movie. And there may be some truth to it, but it's a little overheated for my taste. But still, there's a lot we don't know about the publication of it. What we do know is that Gianfrancesco, who was a very good scholar, who was a bona fide student of Savonarola, acolyte, disciple, worked with his co-editor named Giovanni Mainardi, who was a student of Niccolo Leoniceno, who was a medical humanist who was engaged in a similar project that Giovanni Pico was, of stripping ancient Greek scholars, Ptolemy in Pico's case, Galen and Hippocrates in Leoniceno's case, stripping the medieval Latin and medieval Arabic accretions from the pure, pristine Greek text. So this starts to put together the framework of what we're dealing with. But Pico's text is problematic because it's not a coherent discourse that begins with the beginning and ends with an ending. The way I like to think about it is as a collection of, what's the term? Fragments that are put together by Gianfrancesco in a reasonably coherent way, but you really have to take each fragment on its own terms and build up a picture. And I'm no expert on this, not by a long shot. I wrote a PhD discussing part of it, and now in my volume 2, I'll be dealing with that part in a broader framework. But fortunately, I don't know if you know about this, but Stefan Hyland's recent PhD student, Benjamin Top, has published or is in the process of publishing his PhD on the first 4 books of Pico's Disputations with a revised text, although not based on the original manuscript, because that still doesn't exist, but a much more philologically sound edition of the Proemium through the first 4 books with a German translation. So this is a significant progress in our knowledge. And it's just coming out. It isn't out yet. The PhD is done, accepted, won a prize, and he's turning it now into a book, which should be out reasonably soon.
I was aware of the PhD, but I didn't know it was coming into publishing. That's wonderful news. Wonderful news. Every bit counts.
And of course,
Of
course, Stefan is a great philologist, so his student will be trained in that tradition. I've used it a little bit. I'll be using it more as I finish volume 2.
Yeah, and at some point you were working in a translation yourself, weren't you? You were involved in the project.
I am, and it's a painful topic because it's one of those long-term things that, I'll be working more on it now, and hopefully we'll finish it within the next couple of years. But don't hold your breath. It's more likely now than it has been. Not that I haven't worked on it over time, but it's one of those, and this may well be the time now that Benjamin Top's edition is out with the translation, and I may end up working with him on it, but I haven't told him that yet. Anyway, but it's getting closer. It's not receding. It's getting closer.
Yeah, it's moving forward. That's what counts. Yeah.
But I don't want to tell fantasies about it either.
Yeah, of course. And these projects take time. Really, it's important editions of these kinds of works to be done properly. They take time and to be. You're right. Okay. My interest in Pico is that. Well, I think everyone's interested in Pico in a sense who study history of astrology, is that he has a profound impact on the practice of astrology from the 16th century. He's publishing in the very last years of the 15th century. So his impact is really 16th century and 17th century and onwards. But specifically, I think he is the one that everyone practicing astrology has to contend or dialogue with Pico's work from there on. At that point, although we do have some argumentations, let's call them scientific argumentations considering astrology, we have the theological discussions which come from late antiquity. They were always present. Then we have what we can call perhaps a more scientific approach to the anti-astrological dialogue, which is trying to contend with astrology as a science, as a knowledge, as a practical knowledge, as a scientific valid knowledge, at least for the science of the period that we're talking about.
In both the mathematical sense and trying to understand astrology's natural philosophical foundations, i.e. how celestial influences work. Yeah. Absolutely.
And from my understanding is that Pico is exactly going towards, he's making his attack on astrology mainly from that point of view.
Not necessarily mainly, but that is one. I mean, the thing about the Disputations is that he attacks astrology from many different perspectives, as viciously as possible, sometimes very judiciously, and sometimes kind of rhetorically, hurling fire bombs at it. The part that I have focused on, and the part that I find most interesting, is precisely what you were referring to, his attack on astrology's natural philosophical foundations in book 3 in particular. And I'm looking forward to developing the part in book 4 where he discusses astrology and fate. And I'm hoping to do that in volume 2 as well. But the attack on astrology's natural philosophical foundations, I think it's central to his attack, but it's certainly not the main focus. It's one of the many main focuses, but I think it's a very important focus.
Yes, I had this perception because when I'm reading the authors that I'm studying currently and their attacks on astrology, of course, I'm talking about people who are theologians themselves. So they adhere to Pico's arguments when they want to attack astrology as astrology, while they go directly to the sources when they go to theological discussion. So they don't need Pico for the theological discussion. They use it basically to attack astrology in its own terms, in natural philosophical sense. So I had this perception that was one of the main things, but no. So he does it from however he can. Yeah.
Legally, historically,
Yes.
I mean,
Also philologically, I recall reading that he goes to the sources. He also questions a lot of the books authorships, and he revises a lot of that, and is one of the first to do that at some point.
Oh, absolutely. I have a piece that just came out in the
Yes.
Ptolemaios Arabis et Latinus project's first publication from a conference at the Warburg Institute called Optimus Malorum, where Pico attacks Ptolemy as the best of the worst.
The worst.
Best astrologer of the worst class of people who exist, from Pico's less than humble perspective. And it treats some of the philological dimension of Pico's attack, especially on great conjunctions and on astrology's relation to religion, which is one of Pico's main interests, because he really hates the idea that people think that religion is under the auspices of astrology, which it is, according to Thomas Aquinas, with his view of divine providence and fate, blah, blah, blah. But Pico hates that, and he's trying to obliterate that view. And the material I look at is very interesting. As much as I dislike Pico, because he's a fundamentalist and a fanatic, he can be interesting sometimes.
Yes, of course, yes, of course. Just for people who are viewing, this edition is available as a PDF in the Brew website for free, and I'll put a link to it in the description when this is edited, so that people can download and can read yours and the other chapters. I haven't read it yet, but I'll do it soon.
On the stack by your bed.
Exactly. Things to do. Things to do and to read, yeah. Okay. So back to our character of the day, Pico. He does give I know that, and I think I'm saying this as a general question for people who are watching us. There is this strangeness, as you were saying earlier, in his attack, because the general idea that has been conveyed so far is that the Disputations are sort of an odd thing. Not only by, as you said, it's public posthumously. We don't have the manuscript, the original manuscript, so we really don't know what's Pico's, what's not Pico's, how it will rearrange it. There's a lot of questions going on there. But the Disputationes, so the disputations are always described, or they are described in historiography as something strange, because he has some books, not as large, and suddenly there's appears to be a shift on his focus, and this massive work is produced. How can you tell us
Yeah,
a little bit more about that?
I have a few ideas about this, and this will be one of the themes of volume 2, is people have argued, okay, begin with Frances Yates, right? Because she was the one who got me into this, and it's her argument about the genealogy of magic that I'm addressing explicitly in volume 2, where she argues famously that Pico added Kabbalah to Marsilio Ficino's foundation of natural magic, natural astrological magic in the De Vita. So Pico took that, added Kabbalah to that, and that was his understanding of natural magic. And then the question arises, well, what happened 5 years later, 6 years later, literally 6 or 7 years later, when Pico then turned around and attacked astrology, which he had formerly embraced in the Disputations. So that's a very persuasive argument that is wrong in so many ways, as I argued in my PhD thesis in 2002, and as I will argue more fully in volume 2. Part of the problem is not the rhetorical structure of Frances Yates's argument, which is beautiful and persuasive, but it's wrong both on chronological terms, in that Pico presented his material on magic before Ficino presented his De Vita, in that Pico's early works that his views on magic are drawn from, the Oratio and the Conclusiones and the Commento, were all written in 1486 and 1487, whereas Ficino's De Vita was written in 1489. But the other problem is, perhaps even more fundamental, is that when you actually look at Pico's early views on magic, well, what are Pico's early views on magic? That's a question, right? And what is the corollary question? What is Pico's understanding of astrology in relation to those early views on magic? Now, I'm a simple person, so I think it's more important to ask those basic analytic questions before assuming that you know the answer to those questions, which Yates thought that she did. And of course, she was very knowledgeable. But when I looked at Pico's early views on magic in relation to his early views on astrology, what I found is that, of course, he was incandescent with his passion about magic, natural magic, which he articulated in very little detail in a few of those early works. And in relation to that, it's easy to think, based on some phrasing, that there's an astrological dimension to that. But in fact, at least in my interpretation, and this is absolutely open to interpretation, he found natural magic to be very interesting, and he thought that there was a Kabbalistic foundation to that magic, but there's in fact very little astrology. The texts that people look at most strongly are some of the Kabbalistic conclusions, especially the very last one, which is the very last conclusion of all of his Conclusiones, number 900, that talks about vera astrologia.
Okay.
So it seems like there must be something astrological there. But when you look at his actual discussions of astrology in relation to magic, there's almost no astrology, normal astrology whatsoever, and it does not provide the foundation for his astrology. In fact, for his magic. In fact, my take is that Pico is trying to subvert the normal foundation of magic in astrology in those early works and substituting the planetary celestial influences with the Kabbalistic Sephirot. And I think that there's evidence to make that argument.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I'm not the only one who has, but it hasn't been made strongly, and I will certainly make it strongly in my volume 2. And part of the way I do that is by contrasting it with how Marsilio Ficino uses astrology throughout his De Vita in many different areas, very strongly and very clearly. Whereas in Pico, the astrology, if there is any at all, is very insubstantial and is only used to strengthen arguments he's made from other perspectives. Anyway, this is a difficult thing to say very quickly, but that gives a little taste of it. But it needs to be established, and that's what I'm attempting to do in my volume.
Yes.
So then the attack on astrology at the end of his career is not such a radical leap. He rejects magic at that point. That's the radical shift. And he rejects Kabbalah. That's a radical shift. But he, in my view, was always, what's the word, kind of neutral about astrology. It was there. He didn't like it that much, but he wasn't attacking it. He would use it to strengthen other views, whereas at the end of his life, he attacked it with every fiber of his being. I think because he wanted to remove the astrologers from the kind of prophetic airwaves, There were these publications of annual prognostications. Astrologers were very well respected. They taught at the finest universities. Part of their job description was making annual prognostications that people took seriously. And he, along with Savonarola, wanted to remove these enemies of the people, enemies of the church, from the prophetic airwaves, so that the voice of a true prophet, somebody like Savonarola, could be heard without all this noisy That's my take in a nutshell. And
I understand how you're getting there. Yes, it would explain why then we see such an impact on his such a force on his Disputationes. Yes, it's quite interesting. The fact is, sorry.
No, and remember, the Disputations is one of 7 treatises that he wrote defending the church. It's the only one we have. There is an explicit theological dimension. He's trying to save society from the deleterious effects of astrology. Now, the title in Garan's edition is Disputations Against Divinatory Astrology. And I think that that's significant, but Benjamin Topp also has argued that that's actually not the true title. So I need to take those arguments into account. But if he's right, then that's significant too. But still, within the text itself, there seems to be an attack on divinatory astrology and not on normal, legitimate modes of predicting the future that Thomas Aquinas would have embraced. Anyway, it's complicated, and I don't fully understand it, but I'm trying to understand parts of it and make a coherent interpretation, which can then be criticized.
Yeah, and the dialogue is established, so we can go forward with our knowledge. True. Is the thing is, it does become, I think, the main sources for everyone that criticizes astrology from there on. He's constantly being referred to, and I think we have I'm not completely aware, and might saying something wrong by stating this, but I don't think there is much innovation on the attacks on astrology after Pico until the late 17th century, where you start to enter with a new paradigm of thinking in terms of science, and then perhaps things shift a little bit more in terms of dialogue and how astrology is disconstructed in a critical sense. But and after him until mid 17th century, I'm not sure if there's anything.
In question, because of course our understanding of the cosmos changes so significantly from 1496 when he wrote until the mid 17th century when you start getting alternative paradigms of natural knowledge
Yeah,
from Descartes and from Newton.
yeah,
But before that, there are tremendous changes in our understanding of nature and the cosmos with Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, with Copernicus before that. And those
yeah,
dialogues are related to celestial influences. I mean, Robert Westman is certainly right about that,
yeah,
that these larger questions of planetary, cosmological transformations in relation to astrology need to be addressed.
yes,
Um, and that's a hard thing to do, especially if you're trying to tell that whole story.
exactly.
Uh,
I've been
uh,
trying to see and see, and I've detected a couple of things on how these new discoveries, for example, which completely blow out the ancient cosmological models, which start crumbling from there on. How do they affect astrology? And surprisingly, not that much, at least initially. You don't see that affecting much astrology. I think later on, by the mid 17th century, few things start to pop up. And for example, I wrote a paper on the use of the telescope in an astrological judgment, which well, I think we talked about this sometime, which is the only document that I know of in which an astrologer is making a judgment of an eclipse, and suddenly he is inserting observations that he made of the planets in the
very,
telescope to the judgment.
very interesting.
And this is, I think, unique so far. Probably there are more documents like this that haven't been properly identified, but it's the first time I saw a telescopic observation being added to an astrological judgment. And this is, let me see if I don't give you wrong, this is 1652,
All
if
right.
I recall correctly. So
Oh,
exactly mid 17th century. And it's interesting that this is being done because if this person does it, probably others would do similar things. But we don't have those documents yet, at least no one
sure.
has found them. So there's things started to shift somehow, although the interesting thing that Elena and I have figuring out, it's the practice of astrology doesn't seem to change. I think astrology begins to naturally absorb this kind of new findings. The idea that the comets are not um, a sublunary phenomenon, but something which is high up there with the planets, and even that is absorbed into, and it's transformed and absorbed into the old ways of interpreting things, and that's a very interesting phenomenon, and I think one that needs exploring much more than it has been so far.
Oh, absolutely. With Placido Titi being an important figure in the
Yeah.
transformation as well in relation to all the other changes.
Yes,
No,
and you see this shift going about into in how astrology is defined. Really, things slowly changing as we progress in the 17th century. And I think that would be a study a very worthwhile study to understand not only cosmology but also astrology, how the astrology rationale, what's behind it, begins to change. But even so, I haven't seen. It's not that idea, and I've written that. It's not. Usually, there's this common idea, common knowledge idea that heliocentrism is discovered, and then it shatters completely astrology, and
Nobody thinks that anymore. I mean, not anybody who's been even
not
remote to
yeah,
date on the scholarship.
exactly. Exactly, but it's something that you see in popular culture, or at least in popular scientific, popular history of science, if I can call it that. There's still much of that idea, which has been completely disproved for years by the academic. But there's still that idea, and we don't see that an impact, that big of an impact, I think, in astrological discourse. But Pico, yes, Pico, we see it there much more, constantly having to, every introduction to astrology, I think, from the 16th century onwards, has to refute in one way or another what he said and his work. The only works I've seen that don't do that are very late works, already beginning of the 18th century, where enough time has passed so Pico's work is no longer something that's very clear in the mind of any practitioner or scholar. So it's already faded a bit. There are other things to contend at that time, much more important. But it's still a high impact. And as I was saying, I think every criticism of astrology that I have seen, and I have not seen them all, of course, and not in depth. I think they just pick up on what he says and add a little bit more. But basically, the bases are the same. I don't think there's a great innovation on that regard. I might be wrong because there
That's
are
an
many.
interesting too, exactly. As we find out more, we'll have better answers. I think these are questions well worth asking, and the fewer assumptions we make. I mean, of course, you always have the questions you're trying to answer and the assumption about where it's leading, but more of the focus on the question and less of a
Yeah,
focus
less on the answer.
on what the answers are. Because for the most part, we don't, but we're learning more and more. And it's definitely a progressive process. And there's some really wonderful historians of astrology doing work trying to understand this all over the world and all throughout human history. It's just one of those.
It's one of those topics that has been with us almost since the beginning, or even since the beginning, and it's still here today in its new shape and format.
No, and at this particular moment, between the two conjunctions, the big ones in January of 2020 with first Saturn conjoining Pluto and then Jupiter conjoining Pluto, kind of leading up to what's going on in December of this year with the greater conjunction of Jupiter and
Conjunction, yeah.
Aquarius, shifting triplicity.
Yeah, and it's been a topic that is coming up a lot in academia lately, with because of course with this pandemic, everyone picked up on the topic of the history of epidemics, which we have a lot of material, and it's interesting to see. And we're having this conjunction, of course, and the conjunctions coming up and the cycles and the conjunctions coming up to as an explanation for epidemics and for this kind of events, this worldwide events. And it's quite interesting to see in the last months a whole scholar discussion on the role of astrology in these epidemics in the past, in the pre-modern world, coming in to again to view even as sometimes for people who are not historians of astrology, but they will go and see treatises on epidemics, and the astrological component applied to medicine is always there, which is quite interesting, and also a topic to really study.
Lord.
Yeah. Well, Darrel, I think it's a nice time to wrap up. Thank you very much for this this discussion on Giovanni Pico Della Mirandola, a very important figure for those studying astrology, particularly of the early modern period. I think it's something that cannot be avoided, a cliff that cannot be avoided in this study. Thank you very much for sharing this with us. And I'll direct people for your latest article and to your other articles on the topic, so that they can read a little bit more about your views. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful.